This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, welcoming you back to Economics 101. Today I'm honored to be joined on the line by Peter Dale Scott, famed Canadian poet and political commentator. He is a retired professor from the University of California at Berkeley, and his voluminous writings include Drugs, Oil, and War, and The Road to 9/11. Peter Dale Scott, thank you very much for joining me today on the program.
Well, I'm very glad to be with you.
Well, I wanted to draw on your extensive research in the field of deep politics and the deep state to find out what your research has indicated about the topic of drug money and Wall Street and the connections between the two. And I know that you've done quite a lot of research on the deep state and drug money and drug laundering. So what can you tell us about the possible connections on that front?
Well, there are some areas where I have the ability to get information that other people have not seen. With the question of banks, there is so much secrecy about banking that I'm pretty much limited to what the media have told us. But it's clear that the drug trafficking is a major factor in the world scheme, and some people put it up as maybe number 3, after with oil being the number 1, and then arms number 2, and then drugs number 3. Actually, there's a certain amount of interaction between those, because very often where you're having illicit trafficking of arms, the planes that take arms in one direction, the arms are paid for with drugs, and the planes come back with drugs, and there's quite a lot of that. One of the hard pieces of information recently was the UNODC, that's their Office of Drugs and Crime. The head of it said that he knew for a certainty that in this recent financial crisis, there were certain banks which only survived because they had access to hot money to be laundered from the drug traffic, and that this had kept banks afloat. Another hard source we have is a Senate study done for the U.S. Senate some years ago, which indicated that something like $500 billion was being laundered through the top U.S. banks every year. Not all of that was drug money, but a significant percentage of it was. And the scandal here is that some of the names named in this study are the top U.S. banks, like Citibank. Well, it's known that Citibank has maintained a private bank where they've received funds from people like the brother of the president of Mexico, for example, which funds vastly in excess of what he could possibly have earned from his salary. Yet the only bank really that has suffered as a result of this, and it was, I think, a slap on the wrist, was UBS, which is a Swiss bank. And there are many ironies about that story. They were consciously laundering funds from a drug trafficker right in Boston. And they paid $400,000, I think, in fines, which was only a small percentage of what they had earned by doing this, so it was hardly a disincentive. And the only person who went to jail was the whistleblower, who, in a spirit of public-mindedness, had gone to the U.S. government with the facts of the story, and he was prosecuted for having violated the secrecy which is supposed to surround banking. It's very hard, obviously banks have to be secret in some respect, but there is a major tension between the secrecy that surrounds banking and the notion of an open society.
Well, that's right, and we can hope for more transparency and for more protections for whistleblowers, like in the UBS case, but I guess a lot of people who are analysts and commentators are not holding out much hope for a great deal of reform on that front. But looking back historically for more examples of this type of connection, BCCI is a bank that's often held out in this regard, with the connection of drug money laundering. Can you tell people a little bit about the history of that bank and what it was involved in?
Well, BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, had its beginnings as a Pakistani bank, but I don't think it would have spread throughout the world the way it did if it had not established a relationship with the CIA early on. The CIA relationship began with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in late December 1979. And the CIA didn't have many resources in that part of the world and relied to ship its equipment on Gokal Shipping, which was owned by the same people as BCCI. It was virtually an extension of the BCCI empire. And the financial negotiations for the shipment of arms to that part of the world were handled through BCCI. And because it was being handled through Pakistan's ISI, their intelligence, it's military intelligence, but it's the equivalent of the CIA in that country. Pakistan had very special motives in Afghanistan. They were not interested really in a fully independent Afghanistan, because Afghanistan shares a border with Pakistan, which is in dispute, the so-called Durand Line, which divides Pashtun tribes and even families. And so the ISI were looking for people in Afghanistan to give the money to who would not contest that line. And this meant that essentially the authentic freedom fighters in Afghanistan were largely bypassed in favor of two major recipients for CIA aid. One, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, was thoroughly under control by Pakistan, and another one, Abdul Razul Sayyaf, was a client of Saudi Arabia. Now, because these two recipients had nothing like the same kind of popular base in Afghanistan that the other freedom fighters did, they relied instead on the drug traffic. And this is where we come back to BCCI, because BCCI, from the very beginning, handled the drug trafficking for these clients in Afghanistan. And according to some sources, were even involved in the whole question of arms into Pakistan, drugs coming back out, financing in both directions, that all of this was something in which BCCI was heavily involved, very much at the center, because of its special privileged status with the ISI. And very quickly, that became a privileged relationship with William Casey, the head of the CIA. Now, of course, eventually there were scandals involving BCCI and drugs, particularly in the United States. And the investigation of these scandals led eventually to a Senate investigation of CIA involvement with BCCI, and the CIA said, well, we've looked in our records, we can't find any records. And the Senate inquiry that looked into this deduced that possibly this was true, and that there's no question that William Casey from time to time would see the head of BCCI in Washington, but he did so as a private individual. That is to say, Casey was not only the head of the CIA, but he enjoyed another title as the personal representative of the president on intelligence matters. Under wearing one hat or another, it became common for Casey to go over to meet Abedi, the head of BCCI, in a hotel room with maybe one or two staff people, and very probably no records were kept. But very, very important decisions were made. I think one of these decisions, which is still haunting us, was the decision to recruit Muslims from other countries to serve as a kind of foreign legion in Afghanistan. These are the so-called Arab Afghans. They weren't Afghans, and all of them weren't, in fact, Arabs. And a lot of them were recruited inside the United States. And I think Casey was particularly interested in that because his motive in fighting in Afghanistan was at least partly to inflict maximum damage on the Soviet Union. And these Arab Afghans were recruited for, and also particularly the troops underneath Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Abdul Razak Sayaf were recruited to actually go into the Soviet Union itself and conduct terrorist raids in the Soviet Union.